Hello, hello, and welcome to this edition of the Law Firm Blueprint. I'm one of your hosts, Jay Ruane, and with me, as always, is my man Seth Price down there in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. But we are joined by somebody super special to the legal community and just a super special guy all around, Michael Mogill from Crisp. And Michael, thank you so much for being with us today on this series all about coaching lawyers, because I think you bring a very unique perspective, having been law firm adjacent and now in it with all these law firms, really pushing them to grow. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Seth?
So Michael, this question I've asked number of your colleagues out there, which is you've had the benefit of looking in several hundred, if not more, law firms. What are some of the biggest takeaways, from the perspective of what coaching can do for them?
Yeah. Well, it's the idea of coaching in these days, it's like everybody's a coach is what it feels like, right? Everybody's coaching lawyers. It's like it's the new trend, right? But I don't think that discounts the importance of coaching. I mean, Tom Brady had a coach, right? And he's winning Super Bowls. And I think a lot of it is just the fact that smart people learn from their own mistakes, and wise people learn from the mistakes of others. So to me, I've always looked at coaching from the standpoint of like, how do you help somebody uncover blind spots that they may not see? So if you're going about things on a day-to-day basis, how do you even know that what you're doing is the right thing or the wrong thing? And then simply doing more of it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a learning process that's taking place, right? Like knowledge isn't really power unless it also is accompanied by a change in behavior. And then generally behavioral change doesn't take place unless, someone has a level of like reflection and introspection and self-awareness to be able to determine, okay, well, maybe I need to go about doing things differently. And then if you don't know what you don't know, I've always found that, leadership is such an interesting thing in that, we're all trying to grow our businesses, but isn't it so fascinating that we as leaders, if you are trying to get to somewhere you've never been, so we're trying to take an entire organization of people to a place that we ourselves have never been, and we're dictating the course, right? It's like, imagine you got in a car and you had no GPS or any destination. You're like, all right, guys, who's coming with me? And it's like growing a business in many respects, and that you want to grow, but then how do you actually go about doing that, and how do you navigate that, and how do you solve problems that you've never solved before, or even anticipate challenges that you can't see coming because you've never experienced them yet?
One of the things that it's interesting because I think your business model in coaching is developed this way. Very different challenges, less than a million to three to 10, and 10 and above. And I think it's one of those things that from a coaching marketing point of view, a lot of people just want to say, hey, this is the way it's done. But it seems that like you've given some thought to the different things that are needed at different points in the journey.
Yeah, yeah. So we've used, and this isn't, it doesn't work for necessarily, I wouldn't say it's perfect because revenues doesn't always tell the full story, right? So for example, there's a big difference between a $5 million criminal defense practice and a $5 million personal injury practice, right? Like just to be able to scale that is very, very different. But, but the principles remain the same in that, generally under $1 million, if it's just you starting out, or maybe you and a paralegal or an office manager, something like that, the big challenge at that point is just your capacity. It's your time. It's like you're doing everything. And in order to make progress and to even be able to work on the business, you've got to find ways to free up your time to be able to expand capacity. So whether that involves delegation or automation or hiring or something, but it's basically you're working 24/7, you're doing everything, and the business has hit some sort of limiting factor just because you can't put more hours in. So it doesn't matter if you get the phone to ring more, if you bring in more leads, but if you're working 80 hours a week, it's like, how does that help you in any way if you're doing all the work? So I think that's really where it starts, of getting that time back. And then, once you get beyond $1 million, let's say $1 million to $5 million in many cases, now you're starting to, to build a team. You've hired people, but there's a lot of complexity there because now you're dealing with human beings, and it's like, how do you ensure you're hiring the right ones? And then if you do hire the right ones, how do you ensure you develop them properly and have, onboard them properly and ensure that you're measuring them properly and you have metrics, because you want to ensure that the business remains profitable. And, in any investment you make in hiring someone, ultimately you want that to grow your business. So then there becomes a dynamic of managing and leading people and the complexity that comes with with the growing culture. And then, above 5 million, let's say you have, a certain number of team members, you started to really develop out the culture. Now, you want to make sure it's like, how do you start to build, what could be considered more of like a self-managing organization? And this will take a while, right? So, it's in some cases we see it go from 5 million to 20 million or even beyond, of how do you make yourself less essential in terms of like not necessarily having to be involved in the day to day. And I think this is important for a business in terms of, maximizing the value of a law firm, but also if anything were to ever happen to you, right? If you were so essential, like what happens if you're sick? What happens if you're on vacation? What happens if you get, run over? Like, just, and the less essential you can make yourself, probably the better the business that you have. Doesn't mean that, you don't have to come in. You can do the things that you enjoy. Maybe you love going to trial. Maybe you love working on the business. Maybe you love marketing. You can do those things. Now things get exciting. And then, really beyond 20 million, there's conversations around like succession planning, legacy planning of what does the future of the law firm look like? Is there, a plan in place? How do you really expand that impact? Because at that point, obviously the firm is growing 20 million, 40 million, 80 million and beyond, but, what does it look like, even after you're there, right? And then at the same time, it's like, you've clearly made a ton of money, but now you have an opportunity to make a much greater impact, and not just in your community, but the entire legal industry. So it's different depending on where a firm out in terms of like revenue, what the accountability structure looks like, what the team looks like, but it's a progression. And ultimately, all of this is from the standpoint of why you start a business in most cases. If you ask people enough why questions, it's usually because they want freedom, like the freedom to do things that they want to do with the people they want to do them with, and they want to spend their time however they want to spend it. And the irony is when you start a business, it's like usually if you leave another law firm and you start a firm, that's why you're doing it. And then you have the opposite of all those things, right? Because yes, technically you decide what time you wake up and what time you start working and what type of clients and cases you accept. But if you don't have any clients and cases, and if you don't really have a business, then you don't have a whole lot of freedom. So you're constantly chasing it, and that happens through developing freedom of time, adding team members, increasing capacity. Freedom of money. Obviously, the firm becomes more and more successful and more profitable. Now that allows you to not have to worry about payroll and paying the bills and so on. But then it's ultimately with the freedom of purpose to spend your time however you want, doing the things that you want with the people you want to do it with.
I love that.
When you're going through that process, like that's the good side, right? You're adding
Yeah.
people, they're profitable, you're moving forward. It doesn't include all the stuff we've always talked about offline, the losing a person, the bad review,
yeah.
the this, the that, right? But what are when you look at it, right? That's the rosy. When you take it, one of the things I find interesting, as you've seen so many places, what are some of the missteps you think are avoidable? Because as you see this over and over again, while
Yeah.
every firm is unique, patterns start to emerge in mass that must be clear from 10,000 feet.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that I see, if I had to say across the board, right? We're talking about like pretty much unanimously across all the firms that we work with. I think it really comes down to when there's a compromise in standards, right? Or even like not having a defined standard. So there's this expression that, businesses are destroyed by paper cuts, not sledgehammers. And usually what we find to some degree is that there's something that is tolerated or someone that is tolerated for a long enough time, and it's not really a problem at first, but then eventually like you just either ignore it because you hope this thing just goes away on its own, and then it becomes a massive issue. So either it's some sort of like process issue or a person there that's not super engaged, but they've been with the firm a long time, then they become a cancer, and then they poison the well, and then you don't just have to let them go, and then they're having an affair with somebody else in your office, and then you got to let that person go, and then the entire department's got to go, and then you lose all that case inventory, and now you have an impact in terms of like your caseload and the revenue and the profit, and it just like it compounds because you knew there was an issue a while ago and you didn't do anything about it. So I think a lot of it is just really knowing what's going on under the hood and being able to address those things early on. And then the other thing is, that's what happens when things get bad. But I think what's maybe even worse in some respects is that this is how things stay the same a long time, right? Like this, meaning that things are good, but they're not great. And it's like Sally's been with us a long time and she's okay, but she's not phenomenal, right? Like, let's say she's doing the intake for the firm and she's always done the intake for the firm, right? But is she the best, right? Like what standard are you holding her to? On day one, when the firm started, that was probably one standard. 10 years from then, it's probably a different standard. But in some respects, I don't think it's malicious. But sometimes, good is the enemy of great, and it can hold back a lot of progress that firms can make. But, you've got a lot going on, and, it's like, do I really want to deal with what's going on in the intake? And, at the same time, we got to figure out what's happening in the marketing. And then, I don't really want to deal with this drama that's happening, with the paralegals right now. And then, we really don't need to figure out, kind of a new compensation structure for the lawyers. And it's like, I don't want to deal with this shit right now. And then eventually, not just one problem compounds, but all of those things essentially hit. One day you come in and everybody has a problem, and this person wants to quit, and then another person wants to quit, And now, you're taking like 5 steps backwards.
Wow, I got to say that was one of the most insightful answers we've had in the history of doing this thing. Very, very powerful stuff. I'm going to go back and re-listen to that soundbite. One more question before I toss to Jay. One of the things, coaching has come on, right? If you 10 years ago, barely anybody was going through coaching in the legal space. Now everybody's going through it. One of the things that I think that I see out there is how do you divide up your resources, both coaching, mentality wise, between mindset and actionable? And I see that there are people that sit there and may work on the mindset for a very long time, but great, your mind's in the right place, but you're not getting the hard work of putting the people in place or making those hard decisions you just talked about. How do you balance that?
I love this question because ironically this week I was doing kind of a blast from the past and said, you know this and Jay as well, like over the years, like we've given so many presentations and early on when I was a baby and I would speak at, so many legal conferences, I was looking back at my, kind of some of my earliest presentations, like from the Oblong Ergonomics conference when that used to exist. And,
Oh, wow.
even like some of the small like ABA conferences that had like, 25 people. And the presentations that I would give were so tactical. It was like, do this. Here's how you set up and run an ad. Here, it was just literally like 10 tips, 20 tips, like do this specific thing. And I saw just over the years, they started to evolve to where like a lot of the presentations now are much more like principle focused and would be more mindset heavy. And I was thinking, should I go back to some of the more tactical ones? And what I realized, I mean, this will answer your question, is that if you just tell somebody what to do, or here's a bunch of things that can help you, right? Here's a cool app to use, or here's something that can improve your workflow, or here's some cool prompts for, for Chat GPT. And, someone will see that and immediately feel a hit of dopamine because they're like, okay, you've just given me something valuable. That's cool, right? But the problem is, like, at least what I've seen is that very few will execute on that. And very few will actually do anything with it besides saying, I got a lot of really cool ideas, or will it make any meaningful impact in their firm? So I think where it really starts is like, if it's kind of like AA, right? Alcoholics Anonymous. Like if you can't do step one, admit that there's a problem and be in the right, headspace, right? And the right mind frame, if you will, from the standpoint of how you think about your business. So like to me, mindset is really just the lens through which you see the world, right? It's that it doesn't mean this has nothing to do with like rah or motivation or, pumping anybody up. It's just more so if somebody views the world as saying that I can, my firm can never be successful and it will never be over $1 million in revenue, and that just is not in the cards for me, or I'm not, I'm not smart enough, or I just don't have the skills to be able to do this. Like it does not matter how much information you empower them with if they just do not believe it is possible for them. So from my experience, I find that you have to be able to, bridge that gap of having someone actually have that belief in themselves, and then also look at it from the standpoint of, I mean, you could have a mindset of saying, well, there's not that many cases out there anymore, right? Or it's, there's so many lawyers out there, it's impossible to compete. Or it's futile to even try to go on social media now because there's just so much competition, right? And but instead, if somebody looks at it from the standpoint of saying, well, if another lawyer in my market gets a case, that doesn't necessarily mean it's one less case for me. There's an abundance of cases, right? Like there's plenty out there. And someone may also look at it and say, yeah, I'm in a super competitive market, but the reason I'm in a competitive market is because there's obviously a lot of business and a lot of cases, right? In South Dakota, it's probably not as competitive, but there's probably not as many cases, right? So it just depends through which lens you look at it. So if somebody's in the right mindset, then when you give them the tactical stuff, now they're like, okay, obviously I now believe that success is possible for me. So now I'm going to execute, because the execution is always the difficult thing, right? It's like I'm willing to share everything and anything and everything. And people sometimes wonder, like, well, are you giving away your secrets? Well, one, I don't think there are any secrets, and two, most people aren't going to do anything anyway, right? They're probably not going to execute.
We talk about that a lot.
So it's like in the few that do, I'll respect them for doing it. So I think it's just if you get somebody in the right mindset first, which is really it's just a lot of work, right? It is a lot of work to work through, and sometimes it's not just a mindset of like what it takes to get to $1 million in revenue. There's firms that are at 20 or 30 million in revenue that think that's as far as they go, and if you put them next to someone that's doing 150 million in revenue, and they spend some time with them, and now their whole mindset is expanded. They used to think, man, I could never even consider spending more than 5 or 10,000 a month in advertising, and they sit next to someone who's spending $1 million a month, and they spend maybe the weekend with them. And by the time they come out of that weekend, they now have a completely different outlook of the world and a belief of what's possible.
And then the question really then becomes for them is, are they going to take the action, right? Because, I could sit here and talk to anybody, but if I'm not willing to go back and actually, put in the hard work, I would love to run a marathon. I'll tell you that right now. I am never going to be the guy to go out there and train for a marathon. I know myself. That's just there's other things I love to lift, and that's where I can I stay healthy. But it's one of these things where people actually need to take the action. So I want to ask you this: since you've talked to so many people in law firms, well, first of all, I want to take a step back on that because Seth said something. Everybody's getting coaching now, but I really feel it's probably only like 1% of lawyers I know even understand the concept of coaching. It's a very unique group of people that are attracted to coaching, right? I mean, because I talk to lawyers that I've known for 25, 30 years, and they're like, you have a coach? I'm like, I have a coach, I am a coach. And they're like blown away by that. So there's a whole blue ocean of people out there who could really learn from this, right?
Well, only the ones that want to be successful, right? It's I find that the ones that have coaches tend to be the most successful ones, right? Whoever they have. I mean, just the concept and the idea of having the humility to ask someone for help, right? And willing to embrace a new approach. That in itself, I think, requires just a level of of perhaps maturity or evolution that's necessary. But the ones that they have it all figured out, they obviously would never get a coach. Why would they need a coach?
Yeah, they don't. So my big question for you is, as somebody who's seen into a lot of firms, I am sure at the Chris Summit, which is coming up, we'll definitely talk about that. I'm sure there are people who you have met who've come into your fold and they've been this. I want to do it all right now, this week. I want to do my marketing. I want to do my systems. I want to get my hiring right. And they come in with such enthusiasm, but you can't do everything in the first 10 days of opening the door to the Emerald City, right? You just can't. So have you found either in growing Crisp itself or seeing inside all these law firms, what are some of the early steps that people should be like, look, don't even worry about that stuff that's down the line. Let's get the baby steps dialed in. Where would you start somebody who is just starting on this journey rather than somebody who's got maybe a $5 or $10 million PI operation, has a bunch of employees, has money coming in, doesn't really see a lot of profit, but is a lot more established? Where would you go with somebody who would say, okay, here's where you start?
Yeah, yeah, it's like the old, the old tale of like the tortoise and the hare, right? And I find that if you can get the foundation right early, like this is, every entrepreneur that I speak with that's built, any great business, you ask them like, what do you wish you would have done earlier? And they're like, I really wish I would have documented things from the very beginning. I really wish I would have put those processes in place from the very beginning, because they now know that had they done those things, it would have been much easier and probably much faster to scale, because as they started to grow, now they have a lot of people and now they have a lot of cases and now they got a lot going on, but then they don't have the processes and they haven't documented anything. So as soon as one person leaves, it's like, how do we even find another person? And how do we train them? And how do we ramp them up? And it just becomes a massive stress. And then they lose institutional knowledge the minute anybody leaves. And then you have a lot to lose at that point, because now you're accountable to a lot of team members and a lot of clients. So, Jay, to answer your question, I think, early on, it's, we look at, okay, let's get the foundation right. And it actually starts with clarity of like, what do you want, right? Like, meaning that where are you trying to go? And it's not just like, what do someone will say, okay, I want X amount of revenue, right? And it's just kind of an ambiguous number. So it's important that, well, why is that meaningful to you? And you can want what you want, but is this to enable you to do something you can't do now? Or do you want to just buy something, or does this let you hire another associate, or does this let you, expand, into a new market area, for example? But getting clarity around, okay, what do we visualize this law firm to look like, let's say 5 years from now and 10 years from now? And it's important to have that long-term outlook, because, it's, you ask them, it's like, okay, do you want to be able to do this for a year, or do you anticipate doing this for multiple years in terms of, obviously growing a business? So, start it the right way. So one is just clarity on setting all those metrics, making them quantifiable, like knowing, like, putting a number around it, not just saying we want to grow. Like, what does that look like for you? Working it backwards and saying, okay, well, how many cases that represent? What does the average case value need to look like? Like, even specifics. Okay, then what does headcount need to look like? What is the, what would the support team need to be? Like, how many lawyers are we talking? How many paralegals? How many cases are they managing? Like, just all of that, and just having a blueprint up front of saying we at least have a game plan. Now that can change over time, right? Things will change, like it can evolve, but at least now you have a plan. And then it's looking at it from the standpoint of, well, what could stand in the way of this, right? What are all the reasons why this could not work? Like, what are any potential barriers that need to be overcome? And then addressing those one by one. So I really would start there. I know most people want to jump to and say, let's go to the marketing. Like right out of the gate, they're like, let's just start marketing. and you say, okay, well, what's, who are you for? And they're like, well, we're for everyone. Everyone can get injured, right? And you say, okay, well, how are you going to differentiate? And we're like, we haven't really thought about that. So usually what happens is if you jump straight to the marketing and you don't have clear positioning, or you don't have a clear message, or even if you let's say intake isn't dialed in, or the operations aren't right, it's like all of that can affect the performance of the marketing. So then you just start throwing things against the wall, and then you start getting dissatisfied saying, okay, well, Google doesn't work, or Facebook doesn't work, or, or whatever, radio doesn't work, but all of these things can work. And it's important to know who you're for, who you're not for. And when you have those things figured out, like, your messaging, your positioning, your value proposition, you have a plan in mind of what you're trying to do. Now you can start to break things down and say, okay, year one, here's what we're going to focus on. Let's break this down by quarter. Okay, here's what we're going to focus on: Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. You break that down monthly. You make that into a plan of what has to happen every single week. And then you just execute on the plan, because it's just like anything. Like, I see this with like health and fitness and weight loss. When everybody starts, they start losing a ton of weight. And that's really motivating. It's exciting because they've started, and maybe they're drinking a ton of water, they're getting a lot of steps, they're exercising. But then something happens after the first 30 days, because usually in the first month, they lose like 10 pounds. And they're like, man, I'm well on my way. But then the second month hits, and now they're not losing as many pounds week to week. So they start to get discouraged. And when people get discouraged, they say, well, maybe I should just stop what I'm doing and try something else. And they'll jump from like the one diet they were doing to a different type of diet, and it's just realizing that, the first 30 days or the first few months of anything are always going to be exciting, right? Because it's new. It's like the novelty of it. But then where I think the real strides are made are in doing perhaps sometimes the boring stuff that has to get done, and doing it consistently over time, because those things start to compound. And if you can, you can focus on, hey, what do we need to do to win this week? And you do that every single week. Sometimes it's not, something new or exciting. It's really just getting the fundamentals down. But your ability to stick to those things, I think, can dictate a lot of progress, because where I see a lot of firms make a lot of mistakes is that they abandon things, or they jump from one thing to the next, and they don't give it enough time. Right? No matter what it is, whether it's marketing, whether it's people, whether it's with hiring, like they'll go out and start hiring people, and they'll say there's no good people out there, right? Or it's impossible to hire a lawyer. I don't know if it's impossible to hire a lawyer. I mean, there's a lot of things that are impossible. We've managed to send rockets into space and then reuse them and land them back on Earth, right? So I think it's possible, but perhaps that it is more challenging to do so in a competitive market than it is at a time where, there's much less competition, and perhaps, everybody's out of work, right?
I mean, look, in one sense, the first part of that answer totally spoke to me, because, as a 10 on Quick Start, it took a long time before I listened to Jay Ruane and put the systems in place and had trainers and documented. But one of the things you just talked about, which was the sort of like have a plan and stick with it, one of the things we see a lot from the people we speak to on the show and beyond is that the shiny object very often brings people and veers them off. And so, while good intentions of I'm going to do this as far as hiring or marketing, what have you, there are voices out there, some coaches, some other forces, books, this and that give you things. How do you balance all these amazing ideas? We were just talking offline about the book on hospitality and unreasonable hospitality.
Yeah.
And there's so many things in there. And granted, there are things in there, most of them are fundamentals, but some of these concepts are ones that would theoretically pull you off of what you have as that direction. How do you balance staying the course versus incorporating these amazing things you pick up along the way?
Yeah. So I think that's where, having a plan and having clarity really shines, because if you don't have a plan and you get some cool idea, then, you're like, let's do this, everybody, right? It's like squirrel. But if you do have a plan and you do have things laid out and saying, here's what we're focusing on for the quarter, here's what we're doing this month, then it means that you have to take whatever new thing you want to do through some filter of looking at it from the standpoint of saying, if we're going to do this, this means that something else may not get done. And if I look at it through the lens of this plan, is it of higher impact and higher priority than something else? So in order for something to get prioritized, something else has to get deprioritized. So, that's how you weigh it. And you may look at it and say, hey, this is actually a great idea. I like it, but is it more impactful than what we've got going on this quarter? Probably not. So then maybe we'll look at it in the second quarter.
Right, and that's the academic answer, but we both know, the three of us here have probably likely walked back into the office after doing something, saying, we're all in. And I find it to be challenging. And I see other people who don't that aren't tethered, that don't have any plan, that it really hurts their ability to build and grow, because there are so many different directions they're going.
So I'll give you two other options for this. So one is that, let's say you have a great idea. It is, before you share it with anybody, you simply, I keep a note stock, like nothing fancy. fancy of just like great ideas when I have them. And then I'll make a note that I'm going to sleep on this, or I'm going to give this a day or two, and I'm going to look back at it again. And if I'm still excited about it, okay, then I'm going to share it with someone. And then also before sharing it with someone, I'll map out essentially like what does great look like? What are the success criteria? What's the upside of doing it? What's the potential downside? And then if I work through that for about 20 minutes and I still feel it's important, then I share it with people. Because the problem is that if I just bring somebody in and like I have an idea and I bring a bunch of people into the office and I'm like, guys, we got to do this, then they immediately are like get in action mode, right? And they feel like this is the highest priority thing that we have to do, which, most of the time, pretty much all the time is not. But at least then, it's funny. It's like as I keep this ideas doc, I always review it at the end of the year each year, and I'll look at it and I'm like, man, some of these ideas I thought were great and they were actually absolutely horrible. And then there's a few in there that we ended up executing on. So it just add some buffer between the time at which you are excited and then just to make sure that that's just not an emotion you feel in that particular moment, and you can actually make a business case for it.
We had a
So
fraternity rule about got out of fraternity. There was a 10-second rule where before he could speak, he had to reflect for 10 seconds if it was a good idea. I think this is the professional version of that.
Exactly.
So Matt Homan, who runs Filament out of St. Louis, used to have a blog called the Non-Billable Hour, and he's a former lawyer, and he does this thing that shiny object quarantine. And I downloaded his form, and I have him taped to the back of my office door. And so it's 45 days. Here's the idea. Here's how we'll use it. Tape it to the back of the door, and I'll look 45 days later. If it's still good, we then start to implement it. But I'm not. I can tell you about all of the failed swag and things I have bought for my firm that are sitting in a storeroom right now. That I could say, God, if I can get that money and that time back. There's so many other things I could do with it, because I was quick to throw down the credit card and okay, I'm going to do this today. I'm going to sign up for this service. I'm going to do that. And honestly, to be honest with you, I think it brings it full circle, because that's one of the things that a coach can hold you accountable for, is keeping you on track, making sure that you're focusing on the stuff that matters rather than the stuff that doesn't matter. Right.
Absolutely. And it's just one of the best things that you could ever do. If I'm ever struggling with a decision, I always think about, well, what advice would I give myself if I were the one asking for advice? Like you kind of make yourself like, take yourself out of it, be like third person, right? And coaches do a really great job with this, is because they are not as emotionally tied to, what you've got going on. They have greater clarity, right? They can offer a more unbiased perspective in terms of what's going on. So absolutely. I think having that feedback, and then, I think the best coaches, it's not really there to motivate you or pump you up, right? Like one of the things we always say is like, we don't coach effort, right? Like if you're one of these people that needs to be like a coach to like not be lazy or to actually want to get up and go, it's probably like, I don't know if what you need as a coach. I think what you need is probably introspection and basically really figuring out what it is that you want, right?
Therapist, more than a coach.
Yeah, because I mean, if you had clarity on what you wanted and you knew why you were doing it, then you wouldn't have to drag yourself out of bed every single day. But I think a great coach is there to be, a great execution partner of providing you with the resources that you need to like basically take an idea from vision to reality of like, someone wants to hire someone and say how, or they want to put KPIs around a role, and you're saying, well, what KPIs should they be, right? Like, can you provide me some resources of like, how do I actually define key performance indicators and success criteria for this specific role in my firm, right? That you don't just tell someone like, okay, you need to hire these 3 people, and then you need to like, train them and onboard them, and then you just leave, right? Because someone doesn't know how to hire them, how to fire them, or how to source them, how to ramp them, how to train them, and how to measure them, right? So you have to help them with that. And then there's the accountability piece of, okay, well, when we last met, this is what you committed to. And the simple act of like, committing to somebody else, I think that in itself, it's like, and then also being willing to be held accountable, right? I think a lot of times I think people don't like, sometimes I think people are, they'll dabble, right? Like they'll put like one toe in the water and they don't want to come out and say something like Jay, to your example, like if you ever really wanted to run a marathon, you 100% could do it. Like 100%. All you would have to do, believe it or not, all you would have to do is sign up for the race and then post it publicly on social media and then say that, for every dollar that anyone donates, it's going to go to like child sex trafficking, right? And we're going to support this cause. And what, you're not going to do it now? Like,
right.
You're going to start training like the very next day. Right. But I think a lot of times when, let's say if we're talking about like a law firm, if someone is like half-hearted, right? This is where you can usually tell. They'll say that maybe they don't want that accountability, right? Or they don't want to make that commitment because maybe it's not what they really want. And that's okay, right? You can say like your goals are your goals, right? It's not like a, Price is Right competition where, one lawyer has to one up another lawyer. It's just figuring out, like, again, what is important to you. And then once you make that commitment, that's where I think the coach can really help ensure that there's continuous progress.
I love
Well,
that.
in our limited time remaining, want to give you a chance to tell us about the Chris Summit coming up. It looks like you got some insane speakers.
You got
Once
Will
again,
Guidara talking about
Yeah.
unreasonable hospitality. That's amazing. That's a hell of a get.
Thank you. Yeah. So, we've aimed, this will be our seventh event. It's actually kind of crazy to think about. But yeah, this one, I mean, we've always positioned it as a law firm growth conference, that nowadays it seems like everything's a law firm growth conference, but the whole idea here is that we want to bring together speakers that you're generally not going to see anywhere else, or at least at any other legal conference. And I hear things like, hey, what's Nick Saban going to teach me about growing my law firm? Or what's Will Guidara going to teach me about growing my law firm? Morgan Housel, or, Ludacris. And we look at it through a different perspective, right? Number one, if you bring people together from other industries that offers unique perspectives, like Will Guidara, who wrote Unreasonable Hospitality, running a Michelin star restaurant in New York City, like I think he knows a thing or two about providing great customer service and great client experience, right? That can, if you can bring that innovative perspective to a law firm, I think that gives them a competitive advantage. And if we're going to talk about leadership, I mean, who better than Nick Saban? Right. I mean, this guy knows a thing or two about creating a great culture and winning, because he's able, was able for many years to take a bunch of 18-year-olds, right, who came from all sorts of various backgrounds and get them to work together as a team to win a national title, like consistently year over year, right? There's something to be said for that. So, there's that portion in terms of like just putting together, okay, great speakers, great content, because we want people to learn. And then, Seth, to your point, just like open up new perspectives of what is possible, right? Sometimes, like if you hear from people from different backgrounds, you start to really understand that there's not as many limitations as you might think. And then, and beyond that, of course, there's bringing together, like this year's event, we made it by invitation only, which is, really like, we've always aimed to have great speakers. We aim to have, great entertainment. Like, last year we had Flo Rida, the year before Boys to Men, this year it's Ludacris. So we want people to have a great time, because we believe, right? I know sometimes people see this stuff and they see like DJs and, entertainers and like this big screens, and they're like, oh, that sounds ridiculous. There's nothing substantive there. But no, I believe personally, and again, like, it's, I guess, the people who attend the event, I think you learn a lot better if you're engaged while you're doing it, right? If you are excited, and if you are in an environment that, brings out, an emotional, kind of a visceral impact in you, you might come home and say, okay, now I'm ready to make this change, or I'm ready to do, take this next step or take this next action. And then bringing together like, committed, engaged law firm owners. So part of the invitation aspect of it is that, when you just let anybody buy a ticket, you're going to be in the bathroom and you're going to be at the urinal, and someone leans over and says, do you want to talk about legal funding? Right. And that doesn't make for a great experience. So I think vetting people and ensuring that everybody is, let's say, growth minded, or everybody believes in, running their practice like a business, right? Not everybody does, right? Some people just, think that, it's an abomination, that the event's not for them, and that they're open to sharing. And, because you're going to be around a lot of other lawyers, you're going to be able to network and learn from one another and gain referral partnerships. So I think that's really our vision for the event. If anyone's interested, they can apply at crispsummit.com. The event is November 13th and 14th, which is an interesting time. Do you know what happens the week before?
Yeah, we're gonna. I mean, at some point there's going to be some lawsuits going on November 13th and 14th.
Well,
I don't think it's going to be
the
decided
results
on the
yet,
6th.
right? I still don't think. I don't know that we'll know who's going to be the president at that point.
And it could come to, come down to Fulton County.
Yeah, exactly. So that was actually one of the reasons why I know you guys saw like Will Guidara, but we also got Morgan Housel. So Morgan Housel wrote The Psychology of Money and Same as Ever, and he's like just an economist and financial historian. So he basically talked about that. He looks back through history of, yes, things changed, but how do you prepare for the things you cannot predict and the things you can't anticipate? Like just, black swan events, like the pandemic that we had in 2020, or like this things you just don't see coming. Like, we're big on preparing, and you want to have predictability, but how do you prepare for the things that you can never see coming? So that's like one of the things he's going to be talking about. And I mentioned to him, I'm like, hey, it's the week after the election. He's like, it's perfect, right? Just because who knows what's going to happen. But yeah, I mean, that's really been our vision for the event. And yes, we give away cars, and yes, there's the DJ, and yes, there's on performance. But I think if we take those things out, It's just not a whole lot of fun, or it doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, right? And if you want to get somebody to leave their physical office, right, and fly to Atlanta and spend a couple days there, I think you got to make it worth it for people.
Jay?
I agree. I think that's awesome. I think it's going to be a hell of an event. And I mean, just the speakers that you've announced already are phenomenal. And I know you're going to have more things coming for your attendees. And I think that's really cool what you're doing, because there's only so many ballrooms of big hotels you can sit in and see the same people trotted over and over again, selling the same message. And it just gets boring, and you guys are far from boring. So thanks for sharing that, because I think it's something that this community definitely needs.
Thank you.
All right, Seth, any final question?
No, I think that this has been awesome. I appreciate Michael making the time, and I feel like I got to go back and listen, because a number of those answers were ones that really spoke to me. So I appreciate your time here.
Yeah, there's never any downtime when you're hanging out with Michael Mogill. That's for sure. You're always going to leave a better person than you were before. So, Michael, thank you so much for being with us. I love how you worked in the law firm blueprint into one of your answers to promote the group that we have. And of course, we'll put a link in the show notes and in the episode when we put it up there, so people can apply to get access to the Chris Summit, so that if they want to attend and see all these fabulous speakers, they have a really easy way to do it. So, folks, that's going to do it for us. Thank you again to Michael Mogill for being with us. If you want to take us on the go, you can subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and you can catch this episode and all of our episodes live in our Facebook group and on LinkedIn, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, every Thursday in the Law Firm Blueprint. So that's going to do it for now. I'm Jay Ruane. He's Seth Price. That's the man, Michael Mogill. Bye for now.